So now that we have an understanding of the mechanisms behind pulmonary ventilation, we have what we need to introduce our different lung volumes and capacities. The lung volumes refer to different amounts of air that can fit in the lungs during different actions, and our lung capacities refer to combinations of various lung volumes. There are 4 different lung volumes and 4 different lung capacities, and while you most likely already have or will cover these concepts in your lab class, we're going to take some time to learn each of these. So our 4 lung volumes are referred to as our inspiratory reserve volume, the tidal volume, the expiratory reserve volume, and the residual volume. Each of these individual lung volumes will refer to a different amount of air that can fit in a different part of the lungs at a particular time. We also have 4 lung capacities: the inspiratory capacity, our functional residual capacity, the vital capacity, and the total lung capacity. These capacities are different combinations of our lung volumes, and we'll discuss these after we've covered our 4 lung volumes. So the first respiratory volume that we're going to discuss is the tidal volume. The tidal volume is the amount of air that is exchanged between the lungs and the atmosphere during normal, quiet breathing. We'll remember that our word for that is eupnea. The value for our tidal volume is generally around 500 milliliters. And while males and females will generally have different values for each of our lung volumes, the tidal volume will be roughly the same between both sexes. We also have the inspiratory reserve volume, which I think is named rather appropriately, since this is the amount of volume that is reserved for inspiration. Past the tidal volume, when we take a deep breath, we increase the volume of our lungs, and any volume that is past the tidal inspiration contributes to our inspiratory reserve volume. The inspiratory reserve volume in males is around 3,100 milliliters, or just right about at 3 liters. In females, the inspiratory reserve volume will be closer to 2 liters, coming in at 1,900 milliliters. So again, all of the extra volume that is caused by us taking a very deep breath can be classified as our inspiratory reserve volume. Now we'll also have an expiratory reserve volume, which is just on the other side of the tidal volume. Past the tidal expiration, there is still an amount of air that we can exhale from the lungs. This extra amount of volume that is reserved for expiration is our expiratory reserve volume. Males will generally have an ERV of 1,200 milliliters, and females will generally have an ERV of 700 milliliters. So to demonstrate these 3 lung volumes, we see a spirometer tracing shown right here. A spirometer is a device that will measure volumes in the lungs. And what the spirometer is measuring is volume over time. So as this red line goes up, that indicates that more air is being pulled into the lungs. And as the line goes down, that's going to indicate more air being pushed out of the lungs. So right here, we have a very, very deep inspiration. In fact, the volume in the lungs is going to drastically increase when we inspire. This additional volume past the tidal inspiration is our IRV, or the inspiratory reserve volume. So when we have taken a deep breath, the extra air in our lungs is indicating the IRV. When we exhale, on the other hand, as we continue to breathe air out of our lungs, the amount of air that we can exhale is limited. We can push past the normal tidal volume, but as we continue to exhale, we're eventually going to max out on all of the air that can be breathed out. Any volume past our tidal volume is the expiratory reserve volume, abbreviated as the ERV. We will have one other lung volume here, known as the residual volume. And by definition, the residual volume is what's always left over in the lungs. This volume is present to make sure that the lungs remain patent and that they don't seal shut. And by definition, the residual volume can never be exhaled. We will see the spirometer tracing stopping at the line between the ERV and the RV. This is an indicator that the residual volume will always be found in the lungs. Males and females will have similar values in their residual volumes. Males are coming in at 1,200 milliliters, and females are coming in at 1,100 milliliters. So to summarize our 4 lung volumes, with pulmonary ventilation, the overall lung volume is constantly changing. But depending on how much we've inhaled or exhaled will determine the total amount of air that's in the lung at any given time. Now we also have these 4 lung capacities. The capacities refer to combinations of the different lung volumes, and you can see all of them shown over on this side of the slide. We'll first go over the inspiratory capacity and then the functional residual capacity. The inspiratory capacity is worth between 3.5 liters to 2.5 liters. And we can calculate the inspiratory capacity by adding up the tidal volume with our inspiratory reserve volume. At the point of our normal tidal expiration, we can further inhale to the tidal inspiration and then further to the inspiratory reserve volume. This inspiratory capacity takes into account the IRV and the TV. Now the functional residual capacity is just on the other side of this. The functional residual capacity is worth 2,400 milliliters on average in males and 1,800 milliliters on average in females. And the functional residual capacity can be calculated by adding up the ERV to the RV. If we were to take the inspiratory capacity and add it to the functional residual capacity, that would give us our total lung capacity. The total lung capacity refers to the maximum volume that can fit in the lungs at any given time. We can also calculate the total lung capacity by adding up all 4 of our lung volumes. If we do this, we should see around 6 liters of air in males and 4,200 milliliters of air in females. We abbreviate the total lung capacity as TLC. Now we have one other lung capacity known as the vital capacity. Now the vital capacity is almost the same as the total lung capacity, but it doesn't take into account the residual volume. The vital capacity refers to all of the amount of air that can come in and out of the lungs normally. Remember, the residual volume is always left over in the lungs, so we won't take into account the residual volume when we're inhaling and exhaling. The vital capacity is 4,800 milliliters in males and 3,100 milliliters in females. The inspiratory reserve volume, the tidal volume, and the expiratory reserve volume can all be directly measured by a spirometer. However, since by its definition the residual volume can never be exhaled, we cannot measure this with a spirometer alone. In order to get our residual volume, we would actually have to have the total lung capacity and then calculate out the residual volume by subtracting the vital capacity from the total lung capacity. And we'll see that we can actually extrapolate some of the lung volumes and the lung capacities if we have the values for the right ones. So you can see on this slide, we're further just explaining the lung volumes and capacities. But you'll see the formulas shown here that can be used to calculate our lung capacities from our lung volumes. So just to offer another explanation of these, the tidal volume can be abbreviated as TV, and it refers to the volume of air that is exchanged between the atmosphere and the lungs. This is our body's normal resting breathing, and this is typically the same between males and females. Our inspiratory reserve volume is all of the volume that is in reserve for inspiration. After a forceful inhalation, the additional air that has been brought into the lungs will compose the inspiratory reserve volume. The letters IRV are the abbreviation for the inspiratory reserve volume. The expiratory reserve volume, which is abbreviated as ERV, refers to our volume of air that is in reserve for expiration. Through a forceful exhalation, we can remove the expiratory reserve volume from the lungs, but we will never be able to remove the residual volume from the lungs, as it's always going to stay in there to keep the lungs open. The residual volume can be abbreviated with the letters RV. So you can see each of these capacities shown down here and their formulas. The inspiratory capacity adds up the value of the tidal volume with the inspiratory reserve volume. Our functional residual capacity will take our other 2 lung volumes, the expiratory reserve volume and the residual volume, and add those up together. Our vital capacity will combine the inspiratory reserve volume, the tidal volume, and the expiratory reserve volume, and from here we can take the vital capacity, add in the residual volume, and that will give us the total lung capacity. Now again, we can't measure the residual volume from a spirometer tracing, so you'll generally be given the total lung capacity, and you will have to extrapolate what the residual volume is by adding up these other lung volumes or capacities until you can get your vital capacity and subtract this capacity from our total lung capacity. That will give you the value of the residual volume. But we can treat all of our lung volumes in the same way. Based on the values of the capacities that you are given, and based on the values of the lung volumes that you're given, you want to be able to calculate the values of each of these lung volumes and each of these lung capacities. So we saw Boyle's law, which states that pressure is inversely related to volume. And here we're going to see 2 more laws, namely Dalton's law and Henry's law. Dalton's law states that each gas in a mixture of gases exerts its own pressure as if no other gases are present. Another way to say this is that each gas in a mixture of gases exerts its own partial pressure. In terms of the air we breathe, we have to understand that air is in fact a mixture of gases. Generally, when we consider air, oxygen is what typically comes to mind. But actually, there are many different gases that can be found in the air around us. Nitrogen, in fact, is the most common gas that can be found in air. Specifically, nitrogen composes 78.6% of all of the air that we breathe, and oxygen just makes up a mere 20.9% of all of the air that we breathe. There are many other gases in air, such as argon, carbon dioxide, and water vapor, as well as many others. And what Dalton's law states is that each of those gases exerts its own partial pressure, completely separate of each other. Henry's law, on the other hand, states that the quantity of a gas that will dissolve in a liquid is proportional to the partial pressure of the gas and its solubility. This will be contingent upon the temperature remaining the same. What this means is that gases tend to stay dissolved in solutions better when their partial pressure is higher and when their solubility is higher. One real-life example that we will see of this is carbon dioxide that is dissolved into the blood plasma. The solubility of carbon dioxide is 24 times greater than that of oxygen. So in fact, more of our carbon dioxide can be found dissolved in the plasma, and more of our oxygen will be found in the bloodstream attached to hemoglobin in our red blood cells. Dalton's law and Henry's law will be used to help us understand how oxygen and carbon dioxide can be transported in the blood. But first, we're going to review the concepts of internal and external respiration. So this is not the first time that we've discussed internal and external respiration, but these concepts are very, very important, so we're going to go over these once more. We know that external respiration, also known as pulmonary respiration, happens between the alveoli of the lungs and the pulmonary capillaries. Oxygen is going to move down its concentration gradient from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries, but carbon dioxide is going to move the exact opposite direction. We must remember that oxygen's source is here in the alveoli, and oxygen is eventually going to make its way through the heart and through the blood vessels out to our tissues, where oxygen can be offloaded to our cells and eventually used for cellular respiration. All the while this is going on, carbon dioxide is being produced by these tissue cells as a waste byproduct of metabolism. Carbon dioxide is going to diffuse into the bloodstream and eventually make its way over here to the pulmonary capillaries, where it will move in the opposite direction as oxygen. So external respiration refers to the movement of oxygen from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries and carbon dioxide movement from the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli. Internal respiration or tissue respiration refers to oxygen moving into our tissue cells and carbon dioxide moving into our systemic capillaries. Oxygen and carbon dioxide will always move in opposite directions of each other. And it is internal and external respiration that allow for oxygen to make its way to our body cells from the external environment. But despite hopefully having a good understanding of external and internal respiration, we also have to understand that oxygen and carbon dioxide need to be carried in the blood, and that's what we're going to discuss here. We can see that oxygen and carbon dioxide can enter into the bloodstream, but once they're in there, the question becomes, how are they transported? So we will see that oxygen and carbon dioxide are actually carried quite differently from each other in the blood. There are 2 mechanisms of oxygen transport and 3 mechanisms of carbon dioxide transport. Most of our oxygen, in fact, is carried by hemoglobin in our red blood cells. 98.5% of all of our oxygen is carried in this way. So this is actually most of the oxygen that we need to account for. But we will have the remaining 1.5% of oxygen that's dissolved in our plasma. From here, the oxygen that's bound to hemoglobin and the oxygen dissolved in the plasma can get transported throughout the cardiovascular system until it's able to be offloaded to our body tissues. Oxygen will need to break free from hemoglobin and become dissolved in the plasma before it makes its way into our cells. Oxyhemoglobin is the name for hemoglobin when oxygen is bound to it. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, will be transported a little bit differently. Most of our carbon dioxide is actually transported as bicarbonate ions in the bicarbonate buffer system. 70% of all of our carbon dioxide is transported in this way. We will see another 23% of our carbon dioxide that's actually going to be carried by hemoglobin. This is no longer called oxyhemoglobin, this is now called carb-aminohemoglobin. And our last remaining 7% of carbon dioxide will be carried dissolved in the plasma. So as all of these transport mechanisms are very important, we need to pay close attention to the mechanism that carries the majority of our oxygen and the mechanism that carries the majority of our carbon dioxide. As hemoglobin is going to be our prime carrier for oxygen and bicarbonate is going to be our prime carrier for carbon dioxide, these two systems need to be carefully regulated to make sure that there's enough hemoglobin and a closely regulated pH to facilitate the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Since 98.5% of our oxygen is carried on hemoglobin, regulating hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen has major implications. The factors that affect hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen refer to the partial pressure of oxygen, the overall pH or acidity of the blood, our body's overall temperature, and the type of hemoglobin being considered. As carbon dioxide's transport mechanisms in the blood are slightly different from oxygen's transport mechanisms in the blood, we will see other factors that will regulate the transport of carbon dioxide. I have mentioned that carbon dioxide can be transported in the blood in 3 ways. Some of it, specifically 7%, will be dissolved in the blood plasma, while another 23% is going to be bound to hemoglobin. We call this carb-aminohemoglobin. But the majority of our carbon dioxide is transported in the blood as bicarbonate ions. This series of chemical reactions down here is known as the bicarbonate buffer system, and bicarbonate specifically is HCO3-. This is bicarbonate. We have a hydrogen proton right here. We have carbonic acid shown in the center, and then we have water and carbon dioxide. As this is a buffer system, we can rearrange these molecules, and that will help to resist change in pH. The more carbon dioxide that is present, the more these carbon dioxide molecules are going to react with water. And the more reactions we have, the more carbonic acid will be formed. As more CO2 continues to react with water, that's going to push this chemical reaction in this direction. As more carbonic acid is being formed, that's going to further push our reaction in the direction of hydrogen and bicarbonate. It is in this molecule that we will find the components of carbon dioxide. Now, one thing that we do need to be careful of is too much carbon dioxide. In the case of hypercapnia, more carbon dioxide is going to form more bicarbonate. And the more bicarbonate that's formed, the more hydrogen protons are present. If we build up too much acid, this can lead to respiratory acidosis. So as we now know, the diaphragm is our main muscle of breathing. The diaphragm does exhibit voluntary control, however, it also exhibits involuntary control. This is the reason why we don't have to think to breathe. There are specific regions that can be found up in the medulla oblongata, specifically known as the dorsal respiratory group and the ventral respiratory group. These groups in particular will control the involuntary action of the medulla and the external intercostal muscles. The diaphragm is specifically innervated by what's known as the phrenic nerve. It is very important that we are able to maintain voluntary breathing, but also involuntarily contract the diaphragm so we don't have to always consciously think about breathing. We have chemoreceptors that can be found monitoring the blood for oxygen and carbon dioxide levels. As the levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide change in the blood, this will affect our breathing rate to help better regulate the amount of oxygen making its way into the body and the amount of carbon dioxide making its way out of the body. In the event that our breathing rate goes down, carbon dioxide will not be eliminated from the body as quickly. If there's an increase in carbon dioxide, we call this hypercapnia. The more carbon dioxide that can be found in the solution, the greater the partial pressure the carbon dioxide will be. And as we've already discussed, the more carbon dioxide there will be, the more protons there will be in the blood, making it more acidic. The chemoreceptors are going to be sensing this, and they're going to send signals back to our respiratory centers to increase our rate of breathing to pull more oxygen into the body. Hypoxia will produce the same types of effects. Hypoxia refers to an oxygen deficiency at the tissue level. While hypoxia and hypercapnia are two different conditions, they will affect the body in the same way. An increase in carbon dioxide is treated the same as a decrease in oxygen. We must specifically remember that hypoxia refers to an oxygen deficiency at the level of the tissues. This means that specifically our tissues are not getting the oxygen that they need. There are 4 different types of hypoxia that can lead to this, and many different ways that our body can enter a hypoxic state. High altitudes will naturally have much less oxygen, so it can be more challenging to bring oxygen into the body as you go above sea level. Any type of obstruction in the airway that prevents oxygen from making its way into the alveoli is another thing that can decrease oxygen levels. And fluid in the lung will also prevent the passage of oxygen into the pulmonary capillaries. The 4 types of hypoxia are listed on this slide. We have hypoxic hypoxia, anemic hypoxia, ischemic hypoxia, and histotoxic hypoxia. Each of these refer to a different way to result in an oxygen deficiency at the tissue level. Hypoxic hypoxia is one of the more common types of hypoxia that we will see. As laid out on the last slide, high altitudes, airway obstructions, and excessive fluid in the lungs can all lead to hypoxic hypoxia. This type of hypoxia specifically refers to a decreased amount of oxygen being delivered in the blood. In the event that we've gone to a high altitude, as there's less oxygen as we go above sea level, it can be much more challenging to bring oxygen into our bodies. In the event of an airway obstruction, for example, whatever the obstruction is preventing air from getting into the alveoli. So naturally, once again, we're left with decreased oxygen in the blood. If there's decreased oxygen in the blood, this will naturally mean that not enough oxygen is making it out to the tissues, and therefore we get hypoxia, which is a deficiency at the tissue level. Anemic hypoxia can be caused by a hemorrhage or some other stimulus that's going to decrease our overall number of red blood cells. Perhaps we are able to bring enough oxygen into the alveoli, but if we don't have an adequate number of red blood cells to transport that oxygen, we'll end up with hypoxia at the tissue level. Ischemia indicates decreased blood flow going to a specific area. So with ischemic hypoxia, there's going to be some blockage in blood flow, and without proper blood delivery, our tissues will be deprived of oxygen. Saturating our red blood cells with oxygen is not a problem with ischemic hypoxia. 2 examples that we've seen of this is a myocardial infarction in the heart and a stroke that will take place in the brain. Lastly, histotoxic hypoxia refers to an inability for our own tissues to use oxygen. Once again, oxygen will be carried by our red blood cells, but if our tissues are in some way defective and they can't use the oxygen that's brought to them, this would fall under histotoxic hypoxia. So in summary, to tie together hypercapnia as well as hypoxia, we can see a negative feedback loop shown here. In particular, any stimulus that increases our partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which is another way to say hypercapnia, or perhaps to decrease our partial pressure of oxygen, which indicates hypoxia, will eventually activate the dorsal respiratory group in the medulla oblongata. Remember, I mentioned that hypercapnia and hypoxia are treated the same way by the body. And I've also mentioned that our chemoreceptors are going to be sensing for our carbon dioxide and oxygen concentrations in the blood. If too much carbon dioxide is building or too little oxygen is accumulating, the dorsal respiratory group in the medulla oblongata are going to send signals out to our muscles of breathing to increase the rate of breathing. The more we breathe, the more oxygen we bring into the body, and therefore our oxygen levels are going to go up. And naturally, we're going to exhale more CO2, so our carbon dioxide levels are going to go down. This will eventually result in returning our controlled condition back to normal. So in summary, some of the stimuli that increase our breathing rate are hypercapnia, hypoxia, as well as voluntary hyperventilation. Increased carbon dioxide is treated as the same thing as decreased oxygen, so we'll naturally need to increase ventilation to pull more oxygen in and release more carbon dioxide. This will be done involuntarily by the medulla oblongata, but we can also voluntarily hyperventilate as well. On the flip side, we can see that we can actually voluntarily hypoventilate if we're trying to decrease our breathing rate as well. In the event of hypocapnia, which is a decrease in our blood's partial pressure of carbon dioxide, this will also lead to a decrease in breathing rate, as carbon dioxide levels in the blood need to remain within a very narrow range. Increase in body temperature and pain and decrease in blood pressure will increase our breathing rate, while a decrease in body temperature and pain and an increase in blood pressure will decrease breathing rate. So as we've now hopefully been able to see, the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system work together extremely well to facilitate the overall transport of oxygen from the external environment into our body tissues. Together, these two systems will always work in conjunction, and one example that we're going to see of that is during exercise. With exercise, sympathetic stimulation goes up, and that's going to increase cardiac output. As our cardiac output continues to go up, that's naturally going to increase the blood flow that's making its way to the lungs. We call this term pulmonary perfusion. This is the amount of blood that's flowing through our pulmonary capillaries. As we are exercising and needing more energy, it works out quite nicely that during a time when we'll need more oxygen, pulmonary perfusion is going to naturally go up. Our oxygen diffusing capacity increases drastically during times of exercise. And this refers to how quickly oxygen gets transported into the bloodstream. So in terms of teamwork, as the cardiovascular system's activity increases, the respiratory system's actions are going to increase as well. So to finish up chapter 23, we're going to quickly touch on some of the effects of aging on the respiratory system and discuss a few respiratory disorders as well. Naturally, as we age, the respiratory system's actions are going to decrease. Our lung volumes and capacities are going to go down, so we'll see our vital capacity will decrease with age as well. The ability of our blood to carry oxygen will be much less efficient, as well as the activity of our alveolar macrophages. The cilia along the inside of our trachea are going to break down, and we become much more susceptible to certain conditions related to the respiratory system. Chronic bronchitis and emphysema, which are two types of COPD, become much more common as we age. COPD stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, and emphysema and chronic bronchitis can be classified as these two pulmonary diseases. Emphysema refers to a loss of elastic tissue around the lungs. This prevents elastic recoil and makes it much more challenging to get air out of the lungs. Chronic bronchitis refers to a persistent inflammation of the bronchi. This leads to excessive mucus secretion in the lungs, and that's going to significantly obstruct the airway. This allows for less air to get into the lungs, and naturally we're going to have a harder time bringing oxygen into our bodies. Cystic fibrosis is another condition that affects the respiratory system. However, this condition does not only affect the respiratory system. Cystic fibrosis is characterized by very, very thick mucus coating the inside of the respiratory system. A faulty transporter results in thick mucus in the airway, as well as in other systems that can be found in the body. You have likely heard of asbestos before, and this is also going to affect the respiratory system. Asbestos is a very long material, and when inhaled into the lungs, our alveolar macrophages are going to try to phagocytize this substance. But as this material is too long to be phagocytized, we end up inactivating the macrophages that were trying to destroy this. And then in turn, asbestos is never removed from our body. Pulmonary edema refers to excessive buildup of fluid in the lungs, and asthma is characterized by chronic airway inflammation or airway hypersensitivity. These are just a few disorders that are related to the respiratory system. Lastly, in terms of the pathologies, I'm going to quickly mention some of the effects that smoking has on our respiratory system specifically. Smoking is a very harmful habit to most of our body systems, but the respiratory system in general gets the brunt of smoking effects. Nicotine can be found in cigarettes, which is a very addictive chemical. But also in cigarettes, we'll find lots of irritants, poisons, and a chemical known as carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is a chemical that binds to hemoglobin even more tightly than oxygen binds to hemoglobin. So as we inhale carbon monoxide into our bodies, that's going to take up available spots that oxygen would be present on our red blood cells. Carbon monoxide poisoning can be fatal. However, if recognized soon enough, this can be treated for by giving the patient pure oxygen. So systemically, the respiratory system is going to provide oxygen for all of our body systems. Every single body cell is going to get its oxygen thanks to the respiratory system. Carbon dioxide that's being produced by our body cells as a waste byproduct of metabolism will be removed from those body cells thanks to the respiratory system also. The respiratory system is going to work extremely closely with our cardiovascular system, and both of these systems together can be credited for the necessary gas exchange that is needed by our body. This will conclude Chapter 23 and the respiratory system. If you have any questions about this chapter or need any assistance in the course, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on Canvas. I will see you all in our next video for Chapter 24 when we will begin discussing the digestive system.